Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Friday, February 28th, 2025. Aaron Maté joins us now. Aaron, a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you very much for accommodating my schedule. I want to ask you some significant questions about the war in Ukraine, the changing positions of the Ukrainian side and the funding of the war. But first to Israel. I'm going to play a clip of Prime Minister Netanyahu addressing AIPAC. You may have seen it. I'm going to ask you by what conceivable moral and legal right he can seize land from Lebanon and seize land from Syria and expel their militaries and boast about it. And I want you to pay particular attention to a disgusting joke he purports to tell at the end of this clip. Chris, cut number one.
IDF forces will remain on the summit of Mount Hermon. You should really visit that place. It's a glorious sight. Cold, but a glorious sight. And in the adjacent buffer zone, we will remain for the foreseeable future. We will not allow the presence of the HTS organization or a new Syrian army in the area south of Damascus. Southern Syria will be demilitarized. As for Iran, we crushed a large part of Iran's terror axis through a series of powerful blows which aroused the astonishment and admiration of the entire world. If you're holding beepers, don't worry about it. Don't worry, it's okay.
But what moral and legal authority can he expel the Lebanese army from Lebanon and the Syrian army from Syria? And how despicable is that joke, which was a joke about war crimes and genocide?
Yeah, he's joking about pager explosions that maimed and killed civilians in Lebanon, including children. But that's who he is. Israel is a state that openly embraces state terrorism, aggression, and insists on a monopoly of force. And that's the basis for being able to claim ownership of parts of Syria, especially. Israel paved the way for all this by taking part in the dirty war in Syria. They bombed Syria hundreds of times in the years leading up to the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. They armed the insurgents fighting Assad's government. And now that Assad's been overthrown, now they use the fact that there is a security vacuum, a former leader of Al-Qaeda leading Syria, and they use that as justification to seize more Syrian territory. So it's the height of cynicism. You take part in a global dirty war that empowers an Al-Qaeda-led insurgency, and then when the Al-Qaeda-led insurgency takes over, you cite the fact that that al-Jilani, the leader of Syria, is formerly Al-Qaeda, formerly ISIS, to justify taking more Syrian territory. And unfortunately, the divisions inside Syria, the resentment that existed against the Assad government, the sectarian aspect, that was weaponized and exploited by the U.S., by Israel, by their Gulf allies, to destroy Syria and to leave it destroyed, to leave it fragmented, and now Israel's taking full advantage.
Why does the international diplomatic community accept this cynicism and outright theft?
I don't think it's a question of accepting it. I think it's a question of just not having the power and the courage to stand up to Israel and the U.S., who do have a monopoly on force and are very aggressive in pursuing it. If you vote the wrong way at the UN, you might get all sorts of consequences. I mean, look at all the look at all the Israeli maneuvering at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. There's clearly been cases of intimidation there against people who have defied Israel. There was a report years ago by Richard Goldstone, a very respected South African scholar, who took part in documenting Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And after putting out a report exhaustively showing that Israel was committing war crimes, he went and publicly retracted his report. And there's only one explanation for that, is that he was coerced and blackmailed or intimidated by Israel. So I think that's what explains the relative impunity that Israel has to carry out its actions. But look, it's not total. Every year at the UN, the whole world votes in favor of the global consensus of Palestinian self-determination, for Palestinians to have a state in just 22% of their historic homeland, the West Bank and Gaza. The whole world pretty much votes for that. It's only always the U.S. and Israel with a couple of very small states.
What would happen if the UN expelled Israel?
If the UN expelled Israel, well, I think that'd be very hard to do because the UN recognizes Israel within its recognized borders prior to June 1967.
Well, I mean, they would expel it because of the persistent genocide and refusal to comply with a legitimate order of the UN court to cease the genocide. This is separate and apart from the indictments of Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Foreign Minister Gallant. This is a 15-1 ruling. It's genocide. It must stop. But it hasn't stopped. And Israel signed a treaty agreeing to comply with the court.
Right. Well, look, if that happened, Israel wouldn't care. Israel doesn't care about international law, UN resolutions. It's in violation of so many of them. And also, it's had the U.S. protecting it with a veto. The U.S. has used its veto power so many times to shield, Israel from international law. So if it ever got to that point where Israel was expelled, Israel wouldn't care because they have the backing in their eyes of the only constituency that matters, which is Washington.
Okay. Now to Dulles International Airport. Your thoughts on what happened to our friend and colleague Max Blumenthal while he and his wife and baby were returning from a vacation in Nicaragua, plane stop in El Salvador, flight to Virginia, the United States of America, where he was treated as if it were a totalitarian country or he was a threat to national security.
Well, I heard Max's comments on your show where he framed this in as part of the overall crackdown on pro-Palestine free speech or anti-genocide free speech, and I agree with that. There's been a bipartisan consensus that people who speak out against Israel, who speak out against the genocide, don't have the right to free speech. My friend in Canada, Yves Engler, who I grew up with, he was just detained and spent 5 days in jail after Montreal police told him that he was going to be charged with harassment because he criticized a supporter of Israel on Twitter, on X. He called her a genocide supporter and a fascist. So he was told he was going to be arrested for that. And then when he announced that he was going to be arrested for pro-Palestine free speech, the Montreal police added new charges against him, including harassing the police because he informed the public that the police were going to charge him.
Oh,
and then he spent 5 nights in jail. 5 nights or 4 nights. Sorry, 5 days, 4 nights. And he's finally been released and they've set a trial. So there's a huge crackdown in the Western world right now on pro-Palestine free speech and many other examples of this. Ali Abu Nima of the Electronic Intifada, he was recently detained in Zurich and then deported ahead of a speech he was going to make. And so Max being questioned at the airport, I just see as a part of that. And, he revealed that one of the names that they were interested in was that of Medea Benjamin, the founder of Code Pink. Code Pink's been at the forefront of confronting politicians in Washington over their support for the genocide. If you see all those hearings of Antony Blinken, for example, it's Code Pink members that are leading the charge in calling him out for being a blood-soaked mass murderer. So I see Max's interrogation as a part of that.
Well, all right. Now to Zelensky and the latest on Ukraine. Are you of the view? I sort of got this from one of your X postings that Zelensky has manifested a change of heart with respect to the desirability of actually sitting down in a room with Vladimir Putin.
Well, Zelensky has signed a decree ruling out talks with Russia so long as Putin is in power. He signed this back in the fall of 2022, thereby enshrining the neoconservative Washington goal of regime change. If the only condition under which you'd speak to Russia is if Putin is no longer in power, that means you're endorsing a regime change. Now he's done a complete reversal. Now he says the only Russian I would speak to is Vladimir Putin. And what does that reflect? It just reflects that Zelensky is entirely dependent on U.S. support And so he's desperate to come up with a way to please Donald Trump. And Trump's been talking about facilitating direct talks to end this war. And so Zelensky, now knowing who pays his bills, who he needs to please, is just trying to basically perform for his master.
Now, he's going to continue that performance later on today when he meets President Trump at the White House. And supposedly they signed some sort of an agreement. The text of it hasn't been revealed. I don't even know if there is a text to it. Our friend and colleague, Professor Glenn Deason, says that Trump is not clear what he's talking about, that the vast majority of these minerals are in eastern Russian-speaking Ukraine and under international law are now part of Russia. They're not even Zelensky's. Zelensky doesn't have the legal ability to give mineral rights to them to President Trump, and Trump is either using this as a subterfuge to the American people or is himself being duped. Do you know anything about this, or do you not know any more than the rest of us knows about what the hell is in this agreement?
I've seen some drafts of the agreement. I'm not sure if it's the final text, but I mean, it's really ridiculous. It basically says that Ukraine is going to hand over a lot of its mineral wealth to the U.S. without getting anything in return. It's only getting the U.S. participation in extracting the minerals and profiting from them.
Then what does Zelensky gain other than making Trump happy? What does he gain?
That's what he gains, making Trump happy.
Wow,
that's all he gets.
Is the Joe Biden / Donald Trump pipeline of military aid, is that spigot still open? Is the aid still flowing as we speak?
Yes, it is.
Into Trump's presidency?
Yes, it is. But the question will be, when it runs out, will Trump go before Congress and ask them, as Biden did multiple times, to authorize tens of billions of dollars worth of additional weaponry? And I don't see Trump doing that. Anything is possible with him, so I could be wrong. But given the rhetoric he's already put out there, given the fact that he's insulted Zelensky, called him a dictator, although after Zelensky handed over Ukraine's mineral rights, now Trump has forgotten that he called Zelensky a dictator. He said, "Did I say that?" when he was asked about it.
Yeah, this is actually rather humorous. This is Trump the showman. Chris, I forget which number it is. It might be 17, but play it, please.
The relationship between President Zelensky and President Putin is not a good one. You've noticed, right? It's not a good one. It's not a good relationship.
Mr. President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
I mean, it does make you laugh. That's just his unique entertainment style. He obviously has to walk back the statement somewhat in order to greet Zelensky in the White House in 3 hours.
Yeah, he does. But he's not walking back his statements that the U.S. will not send troops. And he's also not walked back the statement that Ukraine will not join NATO. He reiterated at the White House yesterday that it's not going to happen. And
is he walking back his statement that he would not object to French and British peacekeepers, because that would be a non-starter with the Russians, and he must know that as the president of the United States, unless intel is grossly misleading him. They don't even read the newspapers or watch or visit websites.
Yeah, he claimed the other day that Putin told him Putin would not object to European peacekeepers, which I just don't think is true. I think he's making that up. But look, the important thing is Zelensky said he wouldn't sign this mineral deal with the U.S. unless he got security guarantees. That's what he's going for. And Trump is not giving him security guarantees. The draft of the mineral agreement that I saw just basically says that the U.S. will work to help Ukraine get security guarantees, which means absolutely nothing. That's not the U.S. providing security guarantees. That's, in fact, the U.S. saying, we're not going to give you security guarantees, but maybe we can help you out, get them from somebody else, which, as Zelensky has already said, is useless. Security guarantees without the U.S., Zelensky has said, literally, are worthless, because only the U.S. has the military force capable of deterring Russia should it ever attack Ukraine ever again. But Trump isn't interested. He didn't. He's criticized Zelensky for not making a deal to end the war. His top envoy, Steve Witkoff, made a really interesting comment the other day on CNN, which has proxy war apologists very alarmed.
Yes.
Witkoff said that the basis for new talks will be the Istanbul talks that happened in the spring of 2022. Now, on this show, you and your guests have talked about Istanbul endlessly. On CNN, where Witkoff made those comments, Istanbul has been banned basically from discussion because Istanbul undermines the pro-war narrative. Istanbul shows that, yes, there were peace talks, that Russia and Ukraine were very, very close, which undermines this narrative that Putin doesn't want diplomacy. And moreover, Istanbul was blocked by the US and the UK via a personal message from Boris Johnson to Zelensky, who told Zelensky, keep fighting Russia, and we're not going to give you the security guarantees that you need. So the fact that Witkoff could say on CNN that we're going to base these talks on Istanbul, and then even mention the fact that Istanbul happened, breaks a very big propaganda barrier, and that has proxy war supporters very alarmed.
And CNN is making inane, even insane statements about the American public being too stupid to understand that we're funding the war, something like that. You commented on that in one of your X postings, did you not?
Well, this is punching down, but Brian Stelter, it is. I mean,
well, we both know Brian. Go ahead.
But Brian's like sort of the media correspondent for CNN, and he said, he was commenting on the fact that Americans aren't outraged in mass numbers that Trump is talking about making peace with Russia and Ukraine, and Brian Stelter literally said that this has to do with some illiteracy on the part of the voters who don't know that all their tax dollars are going into U.S. weapons manufacturers. And if only they knew that, then maybe they'd be more outraged that Trump is shutting down the Ukraine proxy war. That's what Brian Stelter said. Now, what's funny about that, beyond the contempt for average voters, which is very common for elite media institutions, it's not true that American voters don't know that their tax dollars are going to weapons manufacturers. Places like CNN love to flaunt it. I mean, and both people in both parties would always say, this is rebuilding our defense industrial base. That was constantly the message. So voters are aware of that. They're just not on board with media elites who think it's a good thing to spend tax money, American resources on funding weapons manufacturers to fuel a horrible war. They have other priorities like fixing our own country. And unfortunately, media elites can't understand that.
Back to the Istanbul Agreement. You probably recall Tucker Carlson's interview with President Putin, in which President Putin actually held his fingers apart to show how thick the agreement was, and then said to Tucker that every page had been initialed by both sides.
Yeah,
this is the agreement that Boris Johnson, at the behest of Joe Biden, when Mr. Johnson was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, persuaded Vladimir Zelensky to walk away from. And this is the agreement, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you just mentioned it a few minutes ago, that Steve Witkoff, the president's chief emissary in the Middle East and now in Ukraine as well, says is the baseline for our negotiations. And this is the agreement that has the neocons in the US and the elites in Europe terrified. Am I right?
Absolutely correct. Witkoff told CNN's Jake Tapper that they were very, very close to signing a deal in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. And then he said that we'll use this as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia. So for people who have spent years pretending as if Istanbul never happened because it undermines their pro-war narrative and because they want to fuel a proxy war with Russia, this is very alarming. And so accordingly, they're very upset. And just to illustrate how scared they are, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday by two Wall Street Journal correspondents about the alarm inside Ukraine at Witkoff's comments. And now that the Wall Street Journal can no longer ignore that the Istanbul talks happened, which has basically just been the standard media practice, at best, Istanbul gets mentioned in passing, but no one ever notes that they were very, very close to signing. Not everything was worked out, but there was a deal very, very close to being reached. And of course, no one ever mentions that Ukrainian officials have said on several occasions that it was Boris Johnson and the U.S. that blocked the deal because they wouldn't offer Ukraine security guarantees to underpin the deal, and they encouraged Zelensky to keep fighting Russia instead. But just to illustrate, now that they can't, just how desperate they are about the talk of reviving Istanbul and alarmed they are, now that they can't pretend Istanbul didn't happen, now they're engaging in outright revisionism. So this Wall Street Journal article in talking about why the Istanbul talks failed. The Wall Street Journal claims that Zelensky ordered an end to the talks because of the discovery of alleged Russian atrocities in Bucha back in the spring of 2022, back in April 2022. Putting aside what actually happened in Bucha, whether or not it was a false flag, which some people speculate, I don't know. But what's funny about this claim that Zelensky shut down the talks over Bucha, it's patently false. In fact, Zelensky said the exact opposite. He went to Bucha and he literally said, the fact that people are killed here is a reason why we have to get peace done. Because if we don't make a peace deal with Russia now, more atrocities will happen.
Well, that is a brand new Zelensky.
Well, it was a very brief Zelensky. It was a very, very brief Zelensky because this was, again, recall, this is before Boris Johnson told him that the U.S. and UK wanted him to keep fighting. So this was in that brief window of time when he was still leaving it open for the possibility of a peace deal with Russia. The week before, you know what he said the week before? He said there are some people that want us to keep fighting because it's in their interests to basically lead to the demise of Ukraine. His words, the demise of Ukraine, if it would mean exhausting Russia. So at that time, Zelensky accurately recognized the goal of his sponsors. And he also said, this is why we have to make peace now to avoid more atrocities. So the Wall Street Journal takes Zelensky saying, Bucha is a reason for us to continue and finalize peace talks. And now they're completely twisting history and saying that he cited it as a reason to stop peace talks. And that's how desperate they are to prevent more peace talks from occurring now.
In the some people never change category, this is aggravating but also ridiculous. Here's Boris Johnson just last week.
Everybody knows there's a minerals deal on the table today, right? And I think it has every prospect of being signed. And frankly, I think it should be signed because it commits the United States in black and white to a free, sovereign, and secure Ukraine. So what we need now is everybody to be serious and to get real and to listen to what Trump is actually saying and doing and proposing. He said he doesn't mind UK troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's great. Well, then we need to make that real. The US is committed, black and white, to a free, secure, sovereign Ukraine. You can't have a sovereign country without the ability to decide which clubs you're going to belong to. Sovereign country can remain committed to joining NATO. That's sovereignty. Sovereign country can remain free to allow whatever troops it wants to come on its soil to support it. That's sovereignty. Now, Putin could never accept that. The US has already committed to that. I think Putin is ultimately going to fail and Ukraine is going to succeed.
Well, he's a madman. He's got blood on his hands, Aaron.
He's desperate because he helped prevent a peace deal that could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And he's also a Trump sycophant. He loves Trump and he's trying to suck up to him. But he's unfortunately trying to ascribe to Trump positions that Trump doesn't have. And again, even if Trump is okay with British troops inside of Ukraine, if Russia doesn't accept that, then it's just not going to happen, or else we're going to have Russia continue to take the territory that it wants. And actually, Trump even poked fun at Keir Starmer yesterday at the White House when he said to Keir Starmer, he said, "Do you think that British troops could take Russia on your own?" And he was trying to basically tell Keir Starmer and remind everyone that the UK has no leverage here at all. And that's why Keir Starmer was so deferential to Trump. Keir Starmer even thanked Trump, he said, for making peace possible, which, by the way, is a tacit admission that previously Biden, who Keir Starmer was following, was making peace impossible. But they have to suck up to Trump because what they want to do now their goal is basically to get Trump to sign on to being what's called a backstop for British and French and other European forces inside Ukraine. So their plan is, okay, we'll send troops, British and French troops, to Ukraine, but we need the U.S. to back us up. So the U.S. won't be on the ground inside Ukraine, but their weapon systems will, their intelligence support will be there, and U.S. troops will basically be parked next door in case there's a confrontation with Russia.
Forget about it.
I don't see Trump agreeing to that.
Yeah. Aaron, thank you very much. Thanks for your time this morning. Thanks for your insight. If you run into Max over the weekend, give him a big hug for me, and we'll see you next week. All the best.
All the best, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up later today at 4 o'clock this afternoon, the end of the day, the end of the week, the Intelligence Community Roundtable with Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.